the 14th of April, 1865. The theater is alive with the sound of laughter. The actors on stage command the room, and the audience leans in, caught in the rhythm of the performance. Abraham Lincoln sits in the private box, his focus fixed on the scene below. Then, the sound of a single gunshot tears through the air. It is sharp, final, and deafening. The laughter dies instantly. John Wilkes Booth steps out from the shadows, a trail of smoke lingering in the air behind him. He moves with frantic speed, vaulting over the railing and landing hard on the stage floor. His boot hits the wood with a heavy thud. He raises a hand to the crowd, his face a mask of defiance. Above him, the box falls into sudden, terrifying silence. Lincoln slumps forward. The weight of his body shifts against the velvet railing. The room begins to surge toward the stage in a wave of panic and disbelief. History pivots on this single, violent second. The man who guided a nation through its darkest fracture has been struck down at the very moment the war finally ends. The echoes of the theater fade into the sharp, biting wind of March 1861. Washington is a city on the edge of a blade. Abraham Lincoln stands before the crowd, his hand raised to take the oath of office. He speaks, but the response from the South is not applause. It is silence, followed by the news of states withdrawing their allegiance. The map is tearing in half. Lincoln walks into the White House and the doors close behind him. The scale of the task settles into the architecture of the rooms. He sits at his desk, ink drying on documents that no longer hold the authority they once commanded. Reports pile up on the mahogany surface, secession ordinances, troop movements, and the resignation of officers. He reaches for a pen, his knuckles white, and signs the orders that will call for militia. He does not look for an exit. He looks at the map on the wall, tracing the lines where the borders used to be. The house is divided, and the foundation is shifting under his feet. He remains at his desk long after the candles burn low, listening to the quiet of a capital bracing for a war that has already begun. The battlefield reports grew heavier with each passing week. Thousands of lives lost, yet the map remained locked in a stagnant, bloody stalemate. Lincoln stood by the window, watching the rain blur the streets of Washington. He realized that preserving the Union was no longer enough. The core of the conflict had to be addressed. He pulled a fresh sheet of parchment onto his desk and began to write. The ink flowed with deliberate, heavy strokes. This was not a military order, but a moral declaration. He brought the draft before his cabinet. The room fell into a deep, uncomfortable silence. Some advisors looked at the floor, others at the walls, fearing the political fallout. Lincoln did not wait for their approval. He waited for the opportune moment, a victory on the field, to anchor his words in reality. When he finally signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the atmosphere in the Capitol shifted instantly. The objective of the war expanded from a political struggle to a crusade for human liberty. This change in purpose rippled across the front lines and through the streets of the North, fueling a new intensity. It brought hope to millions in chains, but it also sharpened the resolve of his enemies, turning the conflict into a battle for the very soul of the nation. The war raged, yet Lincoln refused to let the future wait for the smoke to clear. He brought the Homestead Act to his desk, the scratch of his pen echoing through the silent office. With a single signature, he opened the vast western plains to those who had owned nothing, effectively rewriting the economic landscape of the country. His rivals in Congress slammed their fists on the table, calling it radical, demanding he focus solely on the fighting. He ignored them. He authorized the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, carving a path of iron across the continent that had once been impassable. Engineers and laborers began laying track, inching across the map even as the cannons fired in the east. Every mile of track laid was a strike against the old world. Every land grant issued tightened the grip of the Union on its own future. The opposition grew bitter, sensing that the nation they knew was being dismantled, piece by piece. Lincoln did not flinch. He kept his head down, moving from one document to the next, weaving a new infrastructure of law and steel. The momentum was no longer a suggestion, it was a physical force, reshaping the horizon while the old order crumbled in his wake. When the sun went down, the war did not. Lincoln paced the long, narrow corridors of the White House, his shadow stretching against the walls. The gaslight flickered, casting a dim glow over the stacks of casualty lists piled on his desk. He read every name. He noted every regiment. The numbers were not just ink. They were thousands of lives extinguished in the mud of Virginia. He set the lists aside, picked up a pen, and reached for the parchment. He wrote to a mother in Ohio, then another in Maine. He described the courage of a son he had never met, his hand cramping under the weight of the task. He did not delegate this. He bore the burden of every letter personally. When the letters were sealed, he traveled to the front. He walked through the encampments, boots sinking into the wet earth. He stood among the wounded, his eyes scanning the rows of cots. He saw the blood on the bandages and the gray pallor of the dying. He touched their shoulders, listened to their breathing, and offered no platitudes. He simply witnessed the cost. He returned to Washington with the mud of the battlefield still on his boots, carrying the silence of the dead with him into the night. The news arrived in a frantic burst of telegraph clicks. Appomattox. The fighting had stopped. General Lee surrendered his sword, and the long, grinding machinery of the war finally ceased. In Washington, the air felt lighter, yet the tension remained, coiled and ready. Lincoln gathered his cabinet, his hands steady as he laid out the path forward. He spoke not of victory parades or punitive trials. He spoke of integration. He demanded that the soldiers be allowed to return to their homes, their plows, and their families. He called for a rapid, seamless return to the Union, stripping away the machinery of vengeance. His voice remained level, even as his advisors argued for harsh justice. He pushed back, drafting terms that prioritized unity over retribution. He wanted no gallows. He wanted no martyrs. This mercy acted like a spark in a dry forest. Across the city, in hidden rooms and hushed taverns, the extremists listened. They viewed his vision of equality and his refusal to punish as an existential threat to their own survival. The peace that Lincoln sought was precisely what they intended to destroy. As he mapped out the reconstruction of a broken nation, the shadows around him began to tighten, shifting with a new, dark intent. John Wilkes Booth moved through the back alleys of Washington, his boots silent on the cobblestones. He met his conspirators in the dim, stale air of locked rooms. They spread maps across scarred wooden tables, pinning down the locations of the city's theaters and government buildings. Booth paced the floor, his fingers tracing routes and timing intervals. They watched the White House from the cover of the night, tracking the movement of carriages and the schedule of guards. They knew where the president spoke, when he walked, and which routes he preferred. Every detail was noted in a ledger of violence. They waited for the moment when the public would be distracted by the celebration of peace. Booth tested his blade, felt the cold weight of a pistol, and stared at the flickering candle flame. He whispered instructions to men who leaned in, their faces hidden in the gloom. They were not just planning an assassination. They were preparing to shatter the foundation of the government. The city slept, unaware that the target of their ire was being circled. Booth stepped into the street, his eyes fixed on the theater district. The trap was set. The path was clear. The final act of their defiance was already in motion. The theater was bright, filled with the roar of applause and the heavy, humid air of a crowded room. Abraham Lincoln sat in the private box. His weight settled into the chair. He leaned forward, his focus fixed on the stage. The actors moved, the dialogue flowed, and the audience erupted in laughter. That sound hit the walls and held the room. Then, a sharp, metallic click snapped through the air. A single gunshot tore the laughter apart. The sound echoed, trapped by the ceiling. John Wilkes Booth stepped from the shadows, the pistol still smoking in his hand. He did not hesitate. He vaulted over the railing, his boots hitting the stage with a heavy, jarring thud. Below, the play stopped. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before the screams began. People surged toward the exits. The box became a focal point of frantic motion. Officers and guards pushed through the rising panic, reaching for the president. They lifted him, his body limp and unresponsive, and carried him through the crushing, disoriented crowd. Outside, The news hit the streets like a physical blow. Washington began to reel. The theater was left behind, a place of overturned chairs and shattered order, as the city plunged into total, suffocating chaos. The house across the street was small, narrow, and smelled of damp plaster. They laid him diagonally across a bed that was too short for his frame. The room was packed with officials, their breath shallow, their movements restricted to whispers. Outside, the city had gone quiet, a heavy stillness that pressed against the window panes. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a mantel clock and the labored, uneven rasp of the president's breathing. Every few minutes, a surgeon checked the pulse at his wrist, then shook his head. The hours stretched, thin and brittle. The lamps burned low, casting long, wavering shadows against the wallpaper. Dawn began to bleed through the curtains, gray and cold. The breathing slowed. It hitched, caught, and then smoothed into a terrifying, absolute silence. No one spoke. The surgeon pulled the sheet up, covering the face. The room remained motionless for a long beat. Then, the lead officer turned to the door and stepped out into the street. The sun rose over Washington, illuminating a nation that had fundamentally altered in the space of a single night. The man in the bed was gone, but the weight of his final sacrifice had already begun to settle into the bedrock of the country. The news moved from house to house, street to street, until the entire capital held its breath. A nation that had been a collection of separate states was now bound by a shared, sudden grief. Abraham Lincoln had signed the papers that broke the chains of millions, and in his absence, those actions became the new foundation of the land. The 13th Amendment stood as his final, irrevocable signature on the future. He had redefined the presidency, shifting it from a position of administration to one of moral leadership. The cost was his life, but the result was a country that could no longer be torn apart by the same old fractures. He had moved the moral compass of the people, forcing them to look toward a horizon of equality. Decades would pass, and the history books would solidify his name as the great emancipator, but the real impact remained in the streets of the cities and the fields of the farms. He left behind a vision of an indivisible country. He paid the ultimate price for that unity, and in doing so, he defined the next century of American history. The life ended, but the blueprint remained, etched into the very structure of the nation he had fought to preserve.